The sound of fists slamming against the front door wasn't just loud. It was an act of violence. Each impact was a percussive shockwave that jolted Michael Reeves out of his worn leather armchair, a book tumbling from his lap. This wasn't the tentative rap of a neighbor or the hurried thump of a package delivery. It was deliberate, aggressive, a sound meant not to announce but to intimidate. It was a kind of pounding that preceded a breach. Adrenaline, a familiar and unwelcome ghost from his past, flooded his system. His heart rate spiked, but his breathing, honed by years of discipline, remained controlled. 20 years as a Navy SEAL had conditioned him to operate in that narrow gap between surprise and action. He'd felt the same primal alertness in the dusty streets of Fallujah and the silent corridors of a ship seized by hostiles. But this was his home, his quiet, post-retirement sanctuary in a sleepy suburban cul-de-sac. Before he could even take 2 steps toward the door, the assault escalated. The wood, solid oak he'd personally refinished, groaned in protest. Then came the sickening, unmistakable crack of the deadbolt tearing through the frame. The door exploded inward, swinging wildly on its hinges to smash against the wall. 4 men poured into his living room, a coordinated entry that was far too practiced for casual visitors. They fanned out slightly, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, assessing efficiency that set off every alarm bell in Michael's head. They weren't police. They weren't military. Their uniforms were matching Navy windbreakers, and in stark, garish white letters across their backs, the explanation: HOA enforcement. The absurdity of it was so profound that it kept Michael frozen for a half-second longer. His mind struggled to reconcile the image, the forced entry, the tactical spacing, the hard-eyed expressions with the words on their jackets. The Homeowners Association, the same entity that sent politely worded letters about grass clippings on the sidewalk and the permissible shade of beige for mailboxes. The lead man, a broad-shouldered individual with a close-crop haircut and a clipboard held like a weapon, took a step forward. His voice was a sharp, a fish's bark that cut through the ringing silence. "Michael Reeves, you are in violation of Covenant 12, Section B." Violation. The word hung in the air, thick and ludicrous. Michael's eyes flicked from the man's face to the splintered wreckage of his front door, then back. The disconnect was staggering. They spoke of covenants and sections while standing in the evidence of their own blatant criminal trespass. The initial shock began to crystallize into a cold, focused anger. This wasn't about a violation. This was a show of force. The windbreakers, the shouted legalese. It was a thin veneer of authority slapped over a home invasion. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His weight settled, his hands loosened at his sides. The calm that settled over him wasn't one of peace, but of readiness. The battlefield had just been redeclared, not in some distant war zone, but in his own living room. And Michael Reeves, though long retired, knew exactly how to defend his territory. The 4 men didn't just enter. They conducted a tactical sweep of his living room. Their movements were crisp, coordinated, their eyes scanning corners and assessing threats with professionalism that was utterly at odds with their ridiculous windbreakers. They moved like a well-drilled fire team, not a group of neighborhood busybodies. The one who wasn't scanning the room held a clipboard tight against his chest like a ballistic shield, its laminated surface glinting under the lamplight. The leader, a man with a jaw so tight it looked like it could crack walnuts, took a step forward. He didn't look at Michael's face. His eyes were already cataloging the room's contents. The slightly frayed rug, the bookshelf of military history, the simple, functional furniture. He consulted his clipboard with a theatrical flourish. "Your lawn is overgrown by exactly 2 inches, he declared, his voice flat and devoid of any human inflection. It was the tone of a machine, reading a pre-programmed verdict. Michael blinked, the sheer, staggering absurdity of the statement acting like a mental speed bump. He had to replay the words in his head. The splintered doorframe wept sawdust onto his floor. The violated sanctity of his home hung in the air like cordite, and this man was talking about grass. "You kicked down my door," Michael began, his voice dangerously low, each word measured and precise. "For my grass?" The man's lips curled into a sneer that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Rules are rules. Section 3, Paragraph B of your HOA agreement, which you signed. You are in violation, and non-compliance results in immediate escalation. You will pay the associated fines for violation and the cost of this enforcement action, or worse. Or worse. The phrase hung in the air, a cheap, thuggish threat. A hollow, disbelieving laugh bubbled up in Michael's throat, but he stifled it. This wasn't funny. This was surreal. His mind flickered through a montage of his past life. The oppressive heat of a desert night, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the heart-thumping silence before a high-stakes raid. He had faced down pirates in the Gulf of Aden, terrorists in mountain strongholds, and the sheer chaos of war zones. And now, standing on his own rug, he was being strong-armed and threatened over the length of his freaking front yard. But in that moment of supreme irony, his training took over. Panic was a luxury. Anger was a tool to be sharpened, not a flame to be fanned. The HOA thugs saw a retired man in a quiet house. They saw a problem to be bullied into compliance. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly understand, was the invisible network that stretched out from this very room. They didn't know that Michael wasn't just a homeowner. He was a SEAL, and that was a brotherhood that didn't end with a retirement ceremony. His expression didn't change. He didn't clench his fists or raise his voice. He simply stood there, a statue of calm amidst the wreckage of his door. As the leader droned on about fines and liens, Michael's mind was already elsewhere. He was calculating the quickest path to the kitchen drawer where his old burner phone was charging, the one with exactly 4 numbers saved in its memory. Each one belonged to a man who, right now, was probably living a quiet life just like his. A man who would answer on the first ring, no matter the hour, and whose only question would be, "What do you need, brother?" The HOA had brought a clipboard to a gunfight. They just didn't know it yet. The so-called HOA cops finally left, but their departure was as violent as their entrance. One of them gave a shattered door a contemptuous kick on his way out, slamming the splintered wood against the broken frame in a final act of petty dominance. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet house, a stark contrast to the aggressive pounding that had started it all. Michael stood motionless in the center of his trashed living room, the adrenaline in his veins cooling into a hard, diamond-sharp core of anger. He listened as their engine noise faded into the hum of suburban normalcy. Then he moved. He righted the overturned side table, placed a lamp back on it, and picked up his book. His movements were economical, precise, almost robotic. He wasn't suppressing the rage. He was channeling it, forging it into a tool. In the military, they drilled into you that acting out of pure, hot anger got you and your team killed. But they also taught you a more fundamental lesson. You never, ever let intimidation win. You assessed, you planned, and you responded with overwhelming, precise force. Settling into his chair, he breathed slow and steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He wasn't calming down. He was dialing in. When his heart rate was a steady, metronomic thump, he picked up his personal phone. He bypassed his contacts, his photos, his email. He went straight to a messaging app and scrolled to a group chat labeled simply, The Brotherhood. The last message was a meme from 6 months ago. It didn't matter. The connection was permanent. His thumbs hovered over the screen for a second before he typed a simple, unambiguous message. Need a favor. HOA problem. Bring the team. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The language was theirs alone. A favor was never a small thing. The team meant the old crew. The message was sent into the digital ether, a silent distress flare seen only by a select few. The response wasn't in words. It was in the read receipts that instantly lit up the chat. No questions. No, what's wrong? Just a silent, digital acknowledgement. The cavalry had been summoned. It didn't take long. Just after nightfall, a single pitch-black SUV with government plates rolled to a silent stop in front of the house, its dark, tinted windows reflecting the streetlights. The doors opened in near unison, and 4 men stepped out. They weren't wearing uniforms, just jeans and tactical jackets, but they moved with a predator's grace that screamed military. They were men in their 40s and 50s, their faces etched with the same weathered intensity Michael carried. These were his old teammates. Lopez, the breacher, Jensen, the comms and tech wizard, Miller, the weapons expert, and O'Reilly, their unflappable leader. They didn't knock. They stepped quietly through the wrecked doorway, their eyes immediately taking in the splintered frame, the violated space. They didn't offer condolences or ask for a long story. Lopez glanced at the door and grunted. Sloppy work. Jensen was already pulling a high-tech tablet from his bag. O'Reilly clasped Michael's forearm in a firm grip, his eyes scanning his friend's face. "We heard," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What's the play?" Michael laid it out. They weren't going to hurt anyone. They weren't going to break laws or threaten civilians. This was a different kind of mission. Psychological operations. They were going to send a message to the HOA board. A message so loud and so clear would echo in the quietest of their committee meetings for years to come. You don't mess with a SEAL's home. You don't mess with his family. And you absolutely never, ever bring a clipboard to a war fought with rules, bylaws, and utterly superior intelligence. The next morning, the HOA cops gathered at their neighborhood headquarters, a small, beige office suite tucked into a sterile strip mall at the subdivision's entrance. The air smelled of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. They likely expected another day of petty tyranny, measuring grass blade with calipers, issuing citations for non-regulation mailbox designs, and patrolling the streets in their matching windbreakers, feeding on the quiet resentment of the homeowners they bullied. What they did not expect was the front door to swing open precisely at 9 a.m. to reveal Michael Reeves, flanked by 4 men who looked like they'd been carved from granite and old war stories. There was no dramatic kick-in, no shouted threats. Their entrance was far more intimidating because of its utter silence and control. They moved with a calm, precise economy of motion that instantly sucked the air from the room. The casual chatter died mid-sentence. The head of the enforcement detail, the man with the clipboard, froze with his mug halfway to his lips. Michael's steps were measured and sure as he crossed the linoleum floor. He didn't look at the lackeys. His eyes were locked on the HOA president, a florid-faced man named Gable, who sat behind a cheap laminate desk. Without a word, Michael placed a thick, well-organized folder on the desk surface with a soft, definitive thump. Gable's eyes widened. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just barge in here." "Open it," Michael interrupted, his voice low, steady, and devoid of any emotion. It was the flat, commanding tone of a man used to being heard in the chaos of a firefight. It carried more weight than any shout ever could. Hesitantly, Gable flipped the folder open. Inside was a meticulously compiled dossier of their own illegality. High-resolution stills captured from Michael's port security camera showed the 4 men in stark detail, their faces clear as a forced entry. There were close-up photos of the splintered doorframe, the shattered deadbolt, the boot print on the inside of the door. Paper-clipped to the images were highlighted copies of the HOA's own bylaws, specifically the clauses forbidding entry onto private property without express permission or court order, alongside printed sections of the state penal code detailing criminal trespass, breaking and entering and destruction property. "You broke into my home," Michael stated, the words hanging in the dead silence of the room. "That's not a violation. It's a felony. I could have handled this with the police and a team of lawyers this morning. I decided to give you one chance to make it right." The room went utterly silent. You could hear the nervous swallow of the man with the clipboard, the board members, a handful of other retirees who enjoyed the tiny taste of power, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The illusion of their authority shattered against the cold, hard evidence before them. They weren't community leaders. They were home invaders on a technicality. Then Michael leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the desk and bringing his face close to Gable's. His voice dropped to a near whisper, a tone that promised consequences far beyond any fine. "So, here's the new rule. If you or any of your enforcement team ever set foot on my property again without my explicit permission, I won't call the HOA hotline." He paused, letting the threat solidify. "I'll call the sheriff, and then I'll forward this entire file to every single homeowner in this community. I'll make sure they all know exactly who you are and what you did." Behind him, his SEAL brothers stood perfectly still, arms crossed over broad chests. They didn't speak, didn't glare, didn't need to. Their presence was an unshakable testament to the truth of Michael's words. They were a wall of silence. The silence in the HOA office was thick enough to taste, a palpable mix of fear and shattered arrogance. Gable, the president, stared at the damning folder, his face pale and waxy. The photocopied penal code seemed to glare up at him. Each highlighted section a nail in the coffin of his petty authority. He looked from Michael's unyielding gaze to the 4 silent sentinels flanking the door, their stillness more threatening than any overt gesture. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. With a trembling hand, he reached for a pen. There was no discussion, no negotiation. Under the weight of incontrovertible evidence and overwhelming force, he scrawled his signature at the bottom of a document Michael's friend Jensen had produced from his tablet, a formal, written apology admitting to unlawful entry and property damage. He agreed in writing to cover the full cost of repairing Michael's door with a licensed, bonded contractor Michael's choice. Finally, and most importantly, he verbally dissolved the enforcement unit on the spot, his voice a shaky murmur, promising their methods would never be used again. The news didn't just spread to the neighborhood. It exploded, a wildfire of liberation carried on text messages and whispered over backyard fences. The family on Elm Street finally put up the basketball hoop they'd been afraid to install. The young couple on Maple began planting the vibrant, non-regulation flowers they'd always wanted. It was as if a collective sigh of relief swept through the cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns. Residents stood a little taller, their voices a little firmer when discussing HOA matters. The culture of fear had been broken not by a petition or a lawyer, but by one man who had refused to be intimidated. Michael never spoke of it. He didn't hold court at the mailbox or seek any recognition, but a quiet respect grew around him. Neighbors who had once seen a quiet, retired man now nodded with a newfound deference when they saw him walking his dog or meticulously mowing his lawn, which was, perhaps not surprisingly, now always perfectly and impeccably trimmed. He had become their silent guardian, though he would have scoffed at the title. For Michael, the victory wasn't the apology or the repaired door. It was in the principle. It felt like completing a mission, a successful op on home turf. The objective hadn't been revenge. It had been the restoration of order and the defense of his territory against unjust aggression. It was about standing up to intimidation, just as he had done in far more dangerous places overseas. Only this time, the battlefield was his own neighborhood, and the victory was measured in the peaceful enjoyment of his home and the reclaimed freedom of his neighbors. The lesson was etched into the community's memory. Sometimes bullies don't wear enemy uniforms or wave flags of a hostile regime. Sometimes they wear matching windbreakers and carry clipboards, hiding behind paragraphs of bylaws to mask their petty tyranny. But they all share one universal trait. They back down the same way when confronted by unwavering resolve and the collective strength of good people who refuse to be pushed around. And for the former HOA cops, now just a few embarrassed men in a quiet suburb, they learned a different, more visceral lesson, one they would not soon forget. It was a lesson about consequences and about the profound difference between power and authority. It was a simple warning, echoed in the silent, respectful fear they now felt for their quiet neighbor. Don't go smashing doors down unless you are absolutely prepared for who, or what, might be standing, waiting, and ready on the other side.